Hey guys, it's Paul from Online Sax Academy. In today's lesson, we're going to be looking at all the different contexts you can find a chord like C7 and how these different contexts will affect the kind of note choices you'll make when you're improvising. But just before we jump into those different contexts, let's first of all understand what this C7 is actually telling us. So the capital C is telling us it's what's called a major triad. This is the first, third and fifth note from the major scale, and it creates a major chord that sounds like this. Now the number 7 refers to what's called a lower or flattened seventh. So because we're in the context of C, we take our C major scale, go to the 7th note and lower it by a semitone, so we end up with B flat. And when we add this note to the chord, you can see it brings this distinctive C7 sound. Now the more formal terminology for this would be a C dominant seventh. And you can create dominant sevenths with any of the 12 notes. And you see these dominant seventh chords everywhere, not just jazz, but blues, rock, pop, funk, you name it. But the kind of choices you make on these dominant seventh chords really depends on those different contexts. So for example, let's start with something nice and simple. We're going to start with a 12-bar blues. Now if we take a blues in C, you can see here C7 is functioning as chord 1. It's our home chord. And when we arrive at this chord, we feel like we've come back home again. Now you'll see later on how C7 literally feels like the opposite to home. It really wants to move somewhere else in different contexts. Now in the context of a blues, of course, you can use those basic chord tones that we were talking about earlier. Now for this example and all the other examples in this video, I'm going to be displaying the music in concert pitch to keep things simple. But if you want to play these licks on your sax, either alto sax or tenor, you can get the transposed PDFs for all of the examples. And that's available for free, and the link to that is down below. Now because this is a blues, another option you could take is what's called the major blues scale. And with this major blues scale, you can play phrases like this. Now another darker option is the minor blues scale. And you can see with this scale we have a lot more notes that are outside of the key of C. And this is what brings kind of a darker, more bluesier sound. Now you probably noticed in the blues in C, there weren't just C7 chords, we also had F7 chords and G7 chords. So now if we take a blues in G, where G7 is our home chord, you can see that C7 is taking the chord 4 position. Now in the context of a blues in G, you're probably not going to use the C minor blues scale when you land on that C7. But one option you could explore is the G minor blues scale. And so this is an example of a different musical choice for the same looking chord symbol. So check out this phrase. When we land on that C7 chord, I'm now going to be using the G minor blues scale, and it sounds like this. If we take a blues in F now, you can see that C7 is now in that chord 5 position. Now similarly to the blues in G, because this is now a blues in F, when we land on that 5 chord, we can use the F minor blues scale. Now again, it's very unlikely, or it's going to create a very different sound if you use the F blues scale when you're playing in a blues in C, in the overall key of C. But when you're in a blues in F, you get that really nice bluesy sound with the F minor blues scale. Now another incredibly common place you're going to see dominant seventh chords is within the context of what's called a 2-5-1. This is how we can create a 2-5-1 chord progression. If we take, for example, the scale of F major and we number the different notes from 1 to 7, and then if we build chords on the 2, the 5 and the 1 position, we get these 3 chords of G minor 7, C7 and F major 7. And this chord sequence is everywhere. Now in this context, that C7 is no longer functioning as our home chord, it's functioning as the 5 chord. And when your dominant seventh is functioning as a 5 chord, it gives you loads more flexibility for different choices and put lots more tension into it. And the reason is it's going to be resolving onto the 1 chord, so we're resolving any tension we're creating. Here's an example phrase where when we land on that 5 chord, I'm going to be improvising with what's called the dominant 7th pentatonic. Now this is known as a purely diatonic option, meaning that the notes we're playing on that C7 chord all come from the overall scale of F major, which is the overall key and context we're in. Now, if you wanted to spice this up a bit, you could add in what's called a flattened ninth. Now, the ninth is the same as the second, and so if we lower that to a D flat or C sharp, however you prefer to think about it, we can then use the same notes from the dominant pentatonic, but just lower that D to a D flat or C sharp. And you're going to get a more tense sound, which if you then resolve onto, say, the chord tones of F major when you're improvising, could sound really good. Now, another really common tactic used on these C7s is to turn them into what's called a C7 altered chord. Now, this chord is actually found inside the D flat melodic minor scale. So you just go up a half step and it's that melodic minor scale. What this means is we can pull out things from the D flat melodic minor scale and apply it to our C7 chord, and it's going to create this C7 altered sound. One group of notes I like to play with are these 5 notes. And I suppose you could call these 5 notes like the A flat major, but with a flattened sixth. The label doesn't really matter too much, and you can experiment by pulling out different combinations of notes from your D flat melodic minor scale, and depending which notes you pull out will create different kinds of sounds. Check out what this A flat major flat 6 pentatonic sounds like when you apply it on that C7 chord. And another really cool group of notes you can find within that D flat melodic minor scale are the notes for the G flat major pentatonic, or F sharp major pentatonic, however you prefer to think about it. And check out how that sounds. Notice how these are completely different sets of notes that we're using over the same chord symbol, whether that was a blues in C, G or F, or now a 2-5-1 in F major. And in this context, the reason why we can try all these crazy sounding notes on the C7 chord is that it is resolving to our 1 chord afterwards. Now, that's not to say you can't try out some of these sounds on a blues, but just be aware that, say if you're playing a blues in C and you start playing with the F sharp major pentatonic scale over the top of it, it's going to have a very different sound to it than if you're playing it within the context of a 2-5-1. Now, moving on to another really common progression and different context is when you find your C7 acting as a 2 chord. If you were playing a tune that was overall in the key of B flat major and you came across a C7 chord, in that case the C7 here is often what we call a secondary dominant. And a lot of the time that C7 will then be followed by C minor 7, F7, a 2-5, getting us back home to the key of B flat major. Now, when you see your C7 in this situation, a really popular choice is to choose notes that come from our G melodic minor scale. And you'll hear musicians improvise with this sound all the time when they land on a C7 chord in this context. Check out this example line. Now, there's actually 2 other places where you're going to use a similar sound. We're going to be using the G melodic minor scale when we're on a C7 chord. The first one is over a backdoor progression. In this situation, we're in the overall key of D major, but it's very common to go to chord 4 minor, so that means G minor. We then go to our C7, and then we come back home to our 1 chord of D major. And when you're playing a backdoor progression like that, playing with ideas from the G melodic minor scale can work well. Here's a really famous lick that you can use in this context. Now, the other place where you might use that G melodic minor scale on C7 is when you're in this situation. You have a C sharp minor 7 chord, then you have C7, and then you have B major 7. So what's going on here is that C7 is known as a tritone substitution. You can think of it as a substitute F sharp 7 chord. If we had F sharp 7 there, then we would have a 2-5-1 in the key of B major, chord 2, C sharp minor, 5, F sharp 7, and 1, B major. But there's a trick you can do on dominant 7th chords where you swap out the F sharp 7 for the note that's a tritone away, which is 6 half steps. So we would swap out for C7, and you get this really common progression. Notice how the bass line is falling in half steps from C sharp to C to B. If you see your C7 in this context, taking notes and shapes, pentatonic scales, anything you want from the G melodic minor scale is going to work really well. Now, premium members will be able to download a PDF of all of the phrases played today in all 12 keys. So for example, if you wanted to get to know the different contexts you might find a G7 chord, then you can look up the G7 worksheet and you'll see all of these phrases played where we've transposed them to G7. Now what you'll find when you've really got to know these is when you go back to looking at some tunes you're learning, you'll start to spot the different contexts and chord progressions. You'll start to recognize, there's a 2-5-1, or there's a secondary dominant, here's a backdoor progression. And then you'll be able to make much more informed choices about the kinds of sounds you want to create because you've got a deeper understanding of what's the function of that chord. Is it acting as the home chord? Is it the 5 chord? Is it the 2 chord? Is this in the context of a blues or a swing tune or a ballad? All of these things will help shape your musical choices. Now this lesson is fairly advanced, so if you'd like to step from the very beginning the process of learning how to improvise, then over at Online Sax Academy I have a course that steps you through right from a complete beginner all the way up to improvising over chord sequences like we've covered today and famous jazz standards. And this course, along with all the other courses at Online Sax Academy, is available for all premium members. Now all of this info may seem a bit overwhelming at first, but as with anything you're practicing, you just want to take it one piece at a time. So just choose one particular chord progression and context you find your C7 in and really get to know it. Then look around, see if you can find that in the various tunes you're playing. And once you feel comfortable with that one, then you can move on to the next one. And you'll find the more you do this, the easier it gets. So let me know in the comments down below how you got on with this one. And if you're new to the channel, hit subscribe so you don't miss out on future lessons. And I'll see you guys next week.